You're not what I paid for." Nathan Brody said it loud enough for the whole street to hear it, and he meant to. He looked Evelyn Mercer over, the way a man looks over a horse. He's decided is lame, and then he turned his back on her in front of 40 people. Somebody laughed. Somebody else told her the eastbound coach came through Thursday, if she wanted to save herself the shame of waiting around. Evelyn stood there in the road with one carpet bag, $11, and no home left behind her to go back to. Her hands shook. She didn't let anyone see it, and then she heard a small sound from the wagon behind him. A boy, maybe 6 years old, cradling a hand wrapped in a filthy rag, trying not to cry in front of his father. If that were you standing in that road, would you have gotten back on the coach? Before we go on, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens after that one meal is not what anybody in Red Hollow expected. Give this a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. The stagecoach had been 11 days from St. Joseph, and by the last morning, Evelyn Mercer had stopped pretending she was fine. She'd worn her good dress for the arrival, the gray one with the collar she'd restitched twice, and now the gray was brown to the knee and the collar had gone limp with dust and sweat. She'd slept sitting up for a week and a half. Her hair had come loose. There was a mark on her cheek where the window frame had rubbed it raw, and a burn scar along the left side of her jaw and down her neck, 4 years old, that no amount of arranging a shawl would hide. She'd written about the scar. She'd been careful to. "I should tell you before you decide there was a fire, and my face carries some of it." She had written that sentence 6 times before she'd let herself post the letter, because she'd known what it would cost her, and she'd sent it anyway. The reply had come back in a clean, careful hand. "That does not matter here." She had read that line so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold. So when the coach came down the last grade into Red Hollow, and she saw the town, 20-odd buildings, a church with no paint, a mercantile, a smell of dust and cattle, and something sour underneath, she didn't feel dread. She felt something closer to relief. 11 days. It was almost over. She stepped down and her legs nearly folded under her, and a man in a good coat put out a hand to steady her elbow, and she said thank you, and she looked up. There were maybe 40 people on that street. A wedding was a thing to come out for. She said, "I'm looking for Mr. Brody." The man in the good coat let go of her elbow. He said, "Well," and he smiled, and there was something in the smile she didn't understand yet. "That's him yonder, Nathan. Nathan, your bride's come." The man by the wagon turned around. He was tall, and he was worn out in a way that had nothing to do with the day. Late 30s, beard he hadn't tended, a shirt that had been mended by somebody who didn't know how to mend. He looked at her, and Evelyn watched his face go through something fast. Surprise, then confusion, then a kind of hardening, like a door closing one plank at a time. "No," he said. She thought she'd misheard him. "I'm sorry?" "I said no." He said it louder. He looked past her at the coach, as if there might be another woman still inside it. "There's been a mistake." "Mr. Brody, I have your letter. I never wrote a letter." The street got very quiet. Evelyn felt it happen. 40 people leaning in at once. "You wrote 4, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "The first one was in March. You said the winter had been hard and the boys needed—" "I don't know what you're talking about." "You said it didn't matter." She heard the crack in her own voice and hated it. "About my face. You said it didn't matter." And that's when he did the thing she would think about for the rest of her life. He didn't just deny it. He looked at her. He let his eyes go to her jaw, to the scar, to the dust on her dress, and the loose hair, and the 11 days of coach travel written all over her. And he let everyone on that street watch him look. And then he said it. "You're not what I paid for." Somebody laughed. A woman's laugh, high and quick, cut off fast, but not fast enough. "Oh, Nathan," a voice said from the boardwalk, warm and amused. "Be gentle. She came all this way." That was Victor Langford. Evelyn didn't know it yet. She only knew that the man in the good coat, the one who'd steadied her elbow, was smiling like a man at a show he'd paid good money for. "Ma'am," Langford said, "the eastbound comes through Thursday. Mercantile's got a bench. Folks'll leave you be, mostly." Mostly. He put the word in on purpose. She heard it. Evelyn stood there and understood, in one clean drop, exactly what her situation was. There was no house waiting, there was no return. She had sold her mother's sewing machine and her father's watch to buy the ticket out. And the room she'd rented in Kansas City had been let to somebody else 8 days ago, and $11 would keep her fed for maybe 3 weeks if she was careful and didn't get sick. She was 34 years old. She had been engaged once before the fire. She had spent 4 years learning to be looked at the way Nathan Brody had just looked at her, and she had thought, genuinely thought, that she was past being able to be hurt by it. She was not past it. It went into her like a nail. And what she wanted to do, more than anything, was say something cruel back. She had one ready. She'd noticed the mending on his shirt, and she'd noticed his boots. And she could have opened her mouth and taken the skin off him in front of every person on that street. And part of her, a real part, not a small one, wanted it so badly her teeth ached. That's when the boy in the wagon made a sound. It wasn't loud. It was the sound a child makes when he's been told not to cry and is losing the argument with himself. Evelyn turned her head. There were 6 of them. She counted without meaning to, the way she'd counted patients once. A tall one on the wagon seat, 16 maybe, holding the reins with both hands and staring at the boards like he wanted to go through them. 2 in the middle, 12 and 10, standing too close together. A pair of smaller ones. And the littlest, maybe 6, sitting on the tailgate with his left hand cradled against his chest, wrapped in a rag that had gone gray-brown and stiff. Evelyn looked at that rag, and everything else went quiet in her head. She'd nursed for 2 years in a city hospital before the fire, and 18 months after it in a place that took women with faces like hers because they needed hands more than they needed pretty. She knew what a hand looked like when it had been hurt 4 or 5 days ago and never opened up, never cleaned, never seen by anybody who knew what they were looking at. She knew what the smell of it would be before she got close enough to smell it. She walked past Nathan Brody without a word. "Ma'am," he started. She was already at the tailgate. She crouched down so her eyes were below the boy's and said quietly, "What's your name?" He looked at his father, then back at her. "Sam. Sam. That's a good name." She kept her hands where he could see them. "Does it throb? At night especially. Does it wake you up?" His eyes filled instantly, which told her more than any answer. "Can I see?" "Don't touch him," Nathan said behind her. "I'm not going to." She didn't turn around. "Sam, I won't touch it. I just want to look. You can pull it back yourself, and if it hurts you stop, and I'll stop too." The boy looked at his father again. And what Evelyn noticed, what she filed away and did not understand until much later, was that he wasn't looking for permission. He was looking to see whether his father was going to be all right. Sam peeled the rag back an inch. Evelyn had seen worse. She'd seen a great deal worse. But she had not often seen worse on a 6-year-old whose father was standing 8 feet away with his arms crossed. She said, without any heat at all, "How long has it been like this?" Nobody answered. She stood up and turned around, and she looked at Nathan Brody, and she found that she was not angry the way she had been 30 seconds ago. It had changed into something with more weight in it. "Mr. Brody, that hand is infected. There's red running up past his wrist. If it gets past his elbow, you're not going to be arguing with me about a wedding. You're going to be sitting in a doctor's office deciding whether he keeps the arm." A murmur went through the street. Nathan's jaw worked. "Doc Halloran's 80 miles. I know he is. That's why I'm telling you." "You a doctor?" "No." She let that sit a second. "I'm a woman who spent 3.5 years in hospitals, and I'm the only person standing in this road who's looked at your son's hand today." His eldest boy's head came up. 16 years old, and he looked at Evelyn like he'd just heard a sound he'd been waiting a long time to hear. "Pa," he said. "Caleb, get on the wagon." "Pa, he's been up crying 3 nights. Caleb." The boy shut his mouth. But he didn't look away, and Evelyn saw something in his face. Not fear exactly, something worse. The look of somebody who has already tried everything he can think of. Victor Langford's voice came from the boardwalk, easy and pleasant. "Nathan, if the woman wants to play nurse, let her. Costs you nothing. Lord knows you can't afford Halloran." And Evelyn watched Nathan Brody's whole body change at the sound of that voice. His shoulders came up, his hands closed. Whatever fight he'd had for her, he needed it for something else, and he didn't have enough to go around. She thought, "There's something else happening here that I don't know about." She said, "I'll make you a bargain." "I'm not bargaining that." "Then don't." Listen. She stepped closer, and she dropped her voice so the street had to strain, because she had learned that people believe a quiet voice and doubt a loud one. You've said your piece. Everyone heard it. I'm not going to stand here and beg a man to marry me. I'd sooner walk to Kansas. But that boy's hand needs opening tonight, and it needs it done clean, and there is nobody else. And what do you get? Supper and a roof, and I leave in the morning. She held his eyes. That's it. That's the whole bargain. You don't owe me a word after sunup. You don't owe me a look. And if I say no? Then I'll sit on that bench till Thursday, she said, and I'll think about his hand the entire time, and so will you. That landed. She saw it land. Nathan Brody stood in the middle of the road with 40 people watching him and his 6 sons in a wagon behind him, and a woman he'd just humiliated in front of the whole town looking him steady in the face, and Evelyn watched him lose an argument he was having with himself, not with her. One night, he said. One night. You don't touch my kitchen. Evelyn didn't answer that one, which was its own kind of answer. The ride out was 9 miles, and nobody spoke for the first 4. She sat in the wagon bed with the boys because there wasn't room on the seat, and because she wouldn't have taken it if there had been. The 2 middle ones, Isaac and Wesley, watched her out of the sides of their eyes like she was a dog that hadn't decided about them yet. The little pair, Toby and Jonah, 8 and 7, were bolder, and Toby got about a foot closer every mile until he was nearly against her knee. Finally, Toby said, "Does it hurt?" "Toby," Caleb said from the seat, "it's all right." Evelyn touched her jaw. "Not anymore. It did for a long time. About a year." "How'd you get it?" "There was a fire in the building where I lived. I got some people out, and then I didn't get out fast enough." Toby considered this with enormous seriousness. "So you're brave." "No," Evelyn said. "I was just closest to the door." Sam, from the corner of the wagon bed, said, "Is my hand going to come off?" Every one of his brothers went still. Evelyn thought about lying. It would have been easy, and it would have been kind for about 6 hours. "No," she said. "Not if we do it tonight." "It's going to hurt when I do it, Sam, and I'm not going to tell you it won't, because then you'd never believe me again about anything. It's going to hurt bad for about as long as it takes to say the alphabet, and then it's going to start getting better, and by Sunday it'll only ache." Sam thought about that. Then he said, "Okay." And Caleb Brody, driving the wagon, put his sleeve up to his face and pretended it was the dust. She got her first real look at the ranch in the last of the light, and she understood then that she hadn't been rejected by a proud man. She'd been rejected by a drowning one. The house was cold. Not cool. Cold. In July, the particular cold of a building nobody warms on purpose anymore. There were dishes. There was a smell. The stove was out and looked like it had been out a while. And there was a rope of dried peppers hanging over it that had gone dusty. And Evelyn knew without being told that a woman had hung those and that nobody in this house had been able to take them down. Nathan said, "It's not much." "I've seen worse." "No, you haven't." "Mr. Brody," she said, "I've seen worse." She boiled water. She found a needle and put it in the fire, and she found whiskey where every man in every house in the country keeps it. And she sat Sam on the table with Caleb holding his shoulders and Isaac holding his good hand, and she said, "Sam, you can yell. Yelling's allowed. Some of the toughest men I ever met yelled." He yelled. It took less than a minute, and it was the longest minute in that kitchen in 4 years. Nathan stood in the doorway with his back to it, gripping the frame, and Evelyn saw his knuckles go white and did not say a word about it. When it was done and drained and wrapped in clean cloth, Sam was gray and sweating and hiccuping, and Evelyn wiped his face and said, "That's the worst of it. That's the whole worst of it, and you did it." "Did I yell too much?" "You yelled exactly right." Then she stood up, looked at 6 exhausted boys who hadn't eaten since morning, and walked to the stove. Nathan said, "I told you." "You did." She was already reaching for the ashes. She found flour with weevils in it and sifted them out. She found a hindquarter of venison going borderline and cut back to what was good. Potatoes with eyes an inch long. Onions. A jar of something a dead woman had put up and labeled in a slanted hand. Rachel Septine. And Evelyn set that one aside without opening it, and she didn't know why she did that until much later. It took her 2 hours, and it was not a good meal. The biscuits ran flat. She scorched the gravy and had to start it over, and Isaac saw her do it, and she caught him seeing it and said, "Well, that's ruined." And Isaac laughed. One short, surprised bark of a laugh, like it got out before he could stop it, and then looked terrified. They sat down at a table that had 6 chairs and a bench, and a place at the head that nobody took. They ate like they hadn't sat down together in a year, because they hadn't. Jonah put his elbows on the table and nobody corrected him. Toby asked for more twice. Wesley, who hadn't said a single word to her all day, cleaned his plate and then said very quietly, "Thank you, ma'am," and went red to the ears. And halfway through, Sam said, "Pa, can she stay?" The room stopped. Nathan Brody put down his fork. "Eat your supper," he said. "But can she?" "Sam." Nobody said anything after that. Evelyn washed up while the boys went to bed, and she slept in a chair by the stove because she wouldn't take a bed from a child. And at some point in the deep part of the night, she woke to a sound from the front room and found Nathan Brody sitting in the dark with a stack of papers in front of him and no lamp lit. He didn't look up. He said, "I did write to you." Evelyn stood very still. "I never wrote a word of it," he said, "but I know that hand, and I know why he did it." He rubbed his face with both palms. "Ma'am, there's no ranch here to bring a wife to. There's a paper says I owe $1,100 in back tax I already paid, and a man in town holding it, and come the 1st of September there won't be a Brody on this land." He finally looked up at her. "So you tell me," he said. "What was I supposed to say to you in that road?" And Evelyn Mercer, dusty, scarred, $11 to her name, humiliated in front of an entire town 12 hours earlier, walked over, sat down across from him, and pulled the lamp toward her. "Light that," she said, "and let me see the papers." The papers were a mess. Not because Nathan was careless. Evelyn could see he wasn't. Could see the way he'd stacked them and restacked them, corners aligned, the kind of order a man creates when everything else is out of his control. The mess was in the numbers. Somebody had been very careful to make the numbers a mess. She spread them across the table and didn't say anything for a long time. Nathan sat across from her with his hands flat on the wood and watched her read. She could feel him watching. She could feel him deciding every 30 seconds whether to take the papers back, and she kept her face very still so he wouldn't. "This one," she said finally. She put her finger on a line. "This payment, October, 3 years ago. I paid that." "I believe you. Do you have the receipt?" He got up without a word and went to the back room, and she heard him open something, a box, a drawer, and the sound of him looking, and then silence, and more looking. He came back with a folded paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times it was nearly in pieces at the creases. She opened it carefully, read it again. "This is for a different amount," she said. Nathan's jaw worked. "I know. By how much?" $40. She looked up at him. "And the man you paid?" "Langford's man. He came out here. Said the county assessor had recalculated." Nathan's voice went flat in the way of a man keeping something contained with both hands. "Said it was standard. Said everyone in the valley had gotten the same notice. Said if I argued it, I'd get a fine on top of it." Evelyn set the receipt down. "And so you paid." "I had 6 boys and a sick wife, and $40 wasn't worth the fight." He looked at the table. "That's what I thought at the time." She understood then why the number was what it was. $40. Not enough to go to law over. Not enough to seem like robbery. Enough to sting, and not enough to bleed. And if you did it to enough people often enough, quietly enough, over enough years. She did the arithmetic in her head and felt something cold settle in her chest. "How many ranchers are in this valley?" she asked. 40, maybe, give or take." "How many have you talked to about the taxes?" "It's not something men talk about." He said it simply, not defensively. Just as a fact about the world. "Losing ground isn't something you announce." "No," she said. "I know." She went back to the papers. She worked through them slowly, and Nathan didn't push her, which she noted. Some men would have. Some men needed to fill a silence so badly they'd wreck whatever was in it. Nathan Brody sat across from an almost stranger in his dead lamp kitchen at 2 in the morning and let her think. And that told her something about him that the street scene hadn't. The discrepancy wasn't just the $40. Once she knew what she was looking for, she found it in 4 other payments across 3 years. Small differences, 15 here, 22 there. All going to the same intermediary, all recorded in the county ledger. She would have bet everything she had at the corrected higher amount, which meant the originals didn't match, which meant somebody had touched the originals. "Mr. Brody," she said, "the $1,100 they say you owe." "Yeah. I don't think you owe it." The silence stretched. "I know I don't owe it. That's not what I mean." She turned the paper so he could see. "I mean, I think I can prove it." He stared at the paper, then at her, then at the paper again, like he was waiting for one of them to change. "You can't prove it," he said. "I've been to the county office. The man there told me the records were clear. The records say I owe it." "Then the records are wrong. Ma'am, Evelyn." A pause. He wasn't ready for that, she could tell. "Evelyn." He said it like he was testing the weight of it. "The records aren't wrong by accident. A man like Langford doesn't make accidents. He's got the county clerk. Probably got the judge too. And I've got a stack of paper that says I'm behind and no lawyer within 80 miles who'd take this case for anything I could pay him." "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "No. You're the woman I turned away in the road this morning." He said it straight, no apology in it, but no cruelty either. Just the fact. Plain. "I'm not asking you to fix this." "I know you're not asking me." "Then what are you doing?" Evelyn looked at the dried peppers hanging over the cold stove, at the label on the jar she hadn't opened, Rachel, Septi. She looked at the table where 6 boys had eaten together for maybe the first time in a year, and at the chair where Sam had sat with his hand cradled and his eyes too old for his face. "I'm doing what I came here to do," she said. "I just didn't know what it was until about an hour ago." Nathan Brody looked at her for a long time. Then he looked away, and she saw his throat move. "Get some sleep," he said. The couch in the front room. It's yours. I'm fine in the chair." "You're not fine in the chair. It's a terrible chair." He stood up. "I'll bring a blanket." It was the most gracious thing he'd said to her since she'd arrived, and it was barely gracious at all, and she could tell it had cost him something to say it. She was asleep before he came back with the blanket. She woke to the sound of Toby falling off something. It was not yet fully light, and before she'd finished remembering where she was, Toby was already explaining to the kitchen ceiling that he had not fallen. He had simply come down faster than expected, and Jonah was telling him with great conviction that falling and coming down fast were the same thing. By the time Evelyn found her shoes, Jonah had escalated to physical demonstration of the falling versus fast descending debate, and Isaac had materialized in the doorway, looking pained by both of them. "They wake you?" he said to her. He had his father's directness, and about half his weight behind it. "I was awake," she said, which was close enough. "Pa's out at the fences. He's usually back by 6. She looked around the kitchen. The fire was out. There were no eggs she could see, and the venison was gone from the night before, and the flour was the weevil flour she hadn't finished using. "What do you normally eat for breakfast?" Isaac looked at the table. "Mostly we just wait for lunch." She looked at him. "We don't always make it to lunch," he said. She didn't react. She'd learned that reacting to something a child says in shame makes it worse and makes them feel it later. She just said, "All right, what does your father have in the barn that's living?" "Chickens, but they're not laying much." "2 eggs is enough, go ask." He went, and she found cornmeal and some salt that had gone to one solid block she had to chip at, and by the time Nathan came through the door, she had mush on, and biscuits in the oven, and Toby and Jonah were sitting at the table watching the stove with the specific focus of boys who are genuinely hungry and have learned not to say so. Nathan stopped in the doorway. He looked at the stove. He looked at her. He said nothing. Caleb came in behind him, ducking under his father's arm. He stopped too, saw the stove, and did the same complicated nothing of the face that his father had done. They were so alike it was strange, the set of the jaw, the particular way grief sat in them like an unhealed bone, solid and without complaint. "Sit down," Evelyn said. "It's not fancy." It was not fancy. The mush was too thick in places and the biscuits came out lopsided, one of them visibly more committed to the pan than the others. But the boys ate. All of them, including Wesley, who still hadn't said more than 6 words to her, including Sam, who came down the stairs sideways, protecting his hand, and who looked at the table and then at her and said, "Is that for us?" "Sit down, Sam." "It doesn't hurt as much," he told her solemnly. "I know. It'll keep getting better. Don't pick at the wrapping." "I wasn't going to." "You were thinking about it." He sat down quickly and put both hands under the table, and Jonas said, "She knows things," in a whisper that carried to every corner of the room, and for 1 second Nathan Brody almost smiled. It came and went so fast she nearly missed it. Just a loosening around the eyes, there and then gone, and his coffee went up and covered it. After breakfast, she went out to the fields. She hadn't grown up on a ranch. She'd grown up in a city, her father a pharmacist, her mother a woman who read too much and said so proudly. But she knew the difference between crops struggling and crops dying, the same way she knew the difference between a hand healing and a hand failing. These fields were not struggling. They had been neglected past the point where struggle was possible for this season, maybe the next. The soil was cracked in the places it should have been watered and clotted in the places it should have been broken, and the fence line on the north side had gone down in at least 3 spots she could see from where she stood. She understood, finally, what Nathan had meant when he said there was no ranch to bring a wife to. He hadn't meant that as an insult. He'd meant it as a fact he'd accepted. He'd stopped seeing it as something that could be saved and started seeing it as something that was going. Maybe had been going for 2 years. Maybe longer. Isaac came up beside her. He had a way of appearing without noise, this boy. He'd been watching her, she knew, since breakfast, taking her measure. "He tried," Isaac said. He wasn't defending his father. He was just putting it on the record. After Ma died, he tried, but there's only so much one man can do. "How old are you?" 12? "How long have you been running this household?" A pause. "Ma got sick before she died. About a year before." "So." He did the calculation in his head. 2 years. Give or take. 12 years old and 2 years of keeping the household moving, Evelyn thought. The kind of weight that doesn't show on the outside right away, but shows up 10 years later in the way a man holds his shoulders. "You sifted the flour for me last night," she said, "after I went to sleep." Isaac said nothing. "I saw it was done when I got up." She turned to look at him. "Thank you." He went red. It needed doing." "I know. That's why I said thank you." They stood there a minute, the two of them, looking at a field that was going to need a miracle of the practical variety, and then Evelyn said, "I need to go to town." Isaac's face went careful. "Pa won't like that." "I know. I'm going to tell him myself. I just wanted to know if there was a horse I could borrow, or if I was walking 9 miles. Isaac almost smiled. It was a reluctant smile, more like an admission than a choice. "There's a horse," he said. Nathan did not want to let her go to town. He said so, standing in the yard with his hands on his hips, and she noticed he'd taken off his hat to say it, which she thought was probably unconscious, and probably meant something she'd think about later. "What are you going to do in town?" he asked. "Ask some questions." "Of who?" "People who might answer them." She had the papers in the bag she'd brought from the coach. "I want to look at the public tax ledger. Anyone can do that. It's public record." "Langford will hear about it." "Probably. And then he'll send somebody out here." "Probably," she said again. Nathan stared at her. "You're not bothered by that." "Oh, I'm bothered," she said. "I'm just not going to let it stop me." She got her foot in the stirrup. "I'll be back before dark. Don't let Sam pick at the wrapping." She rode the 9 miles into Red Hollow, thinking about numbers. She was not a lawyer. She had never pretended to be. But she had spent 2 years recording patient information in a hospital where records were the difference between a man keeping his leg and losing it, and she knew how records were supposed to look. She knew what the baseline was. She knew what deviation looked like, and she knew that the hardest deviations to catch were the ones that looked like noise, small variations, human error, close but not right numbers that a man in a hurry would wave through without a second look. The county records office was in a building that smelled like mice and old paper, and the clerk behind the desk was a small man with ink on his fingers and an expression that wanted to be helpful and was managing about 60% of it. She asked for the tax ledger for the Valley ranches going back 10 years. The clerk brought them. She signed her name, sat at the table they gave her, and opened the first one. 2 hours later, she had 6 pages of notes and a very clear picture. It wasn't just Nathan, that she had suspected, but the pattern was cleaner than she'd expected and messier in a way that was almost worse. Because it wasn't all the same amount, and it wasn't all the same year, and whoever had done this had been smart enough to make it look like administrative chaos rather than intent. Some ranchers overpaid by $12, some by $60. Some had received credit adjustments that looked like corrections but that reduced their official payment totals while the cash went somewhere else. The total, across 10 years, and she could see at minimum 23 affected properties, was not a number she wanted to say out loud in that room. She was copying the last column when a shadow fell across the page. "You're the Brody woman." She didn't look up immediately. She finished the number she was writing, then she turned. The man was not Langford. He was younger, maybe 30, with the kind of build that meant he'd been hired for it. He was standing too close for politeness, which she thought was deliberate. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," she said. "You're copying county records." "That's legal." "Sure it is." He had the flat, pleasant voice of a man who'd been told to sound friendly. "Mr. Langford wanted me to let you know he's aware you're in town. He'd like to extend an invitation to dinner." "That's kind of him." She folded her notes and put them in her bag. "Tell him I'm busy." "He'll be disappointed." "I imagine so." She stood up. She came up to maybe the man's collarbone. She stood like she was at the same height. "Is that all?" He watched her. She watched him back. There was a long moment where he was deciding something, and she let him decide it, and ultimately the presence of the clerk across the room and the public nature of the office decided it for him. "Evening, ma'am," he said, and stepped aside. She walked out without hurrying. She mounted the horse without hurrying. She rode 3 blocks before she let out the breath she'd been holding. Then she pointed the horse toward the road and let it run. Nathan was at the fence when she got back. She could see him from the road, that tall, worn silhouette against the evening, hammer in hand, working a post back into the ground alone. She pulled up beside the fence, and he looked at her and looked at the bag, and then looked at her face. "Langford knows," he said. "His man found me at the records office." Nathan drove the post with 2 more swings, hard swings, the kind that had frustration behind them. "I told you he would." "You did." She got down from the horse. "Nathan." She hadn't used his name to him before. He heard it. She could see him hear it. "It's not just you. I found 23 properties. Maybe more if I had more time in those books. He's been doing this for at least 10 years. The hammer stopped. 23, he said. 23 that I can document. 23 families that paid money they didn't owe and have records that say otherwise. She held the bag up. "I have it all here." Nathan looked at the fence post, at the hammer, at the dark coming across the valley like a slow tide. She could almost see him doing the same thing he'd done in the kitchen, taking the measure of a new set of facts, trying to find where the walls were. "He's got the county judge," Nathan said. "I told you." "I know." She thought about the 2-hour ride back, about what she'd been turning over the whole way. "Is there a federal circuit court in this territory?" He went still. "Langford can own one judge," she said. "He can own a county clerk. He can probably own 2 or 3 things in this county, but he can't own a federal circuit, and tax fraud across 23 properties over 10 years isn't a county matter anymore." Nathan stared at her. "I don't know any federal judges," he said slowly. "Neither do I. But I know what the law says about this, and I know what these records show, and any judge who reads them, Evelyn." Her name again, this time like a brake being applied. "What you're describing, that's months of work. That's travel. That's money for a filing and probably a lawyer even if we can find one who'll take it on." He looked at the house, at the lighted window where she could just see Caleb moving inside. "September 1st, that's when the seizure order goes through. I've got 6 weeks. She'd already done that arithmetic. "I know," she said. 6 weeks isn't enough to fight something like this." "Probably not," she said honestly. "But here's what I keep thinking about." She moved to the fence and leaned against the post he'd just fixed, because her legs were tired from the long ride, and she was done pretending they weren't. "He didn't come after you because you're weak. He came after you because you're alone. All 23 of those families are alone. Everyone in that valley has been treated like they're the only one this happened to, and so everyone in that valley sat with their papers in the dark and thought they were the only fool who let Langford walk off with their money." She looked at Nathan. "What happens if they find out they weren't?" Nathan said nothing. "What happens if you ride to 23 ranches and you lay your papers next to their papers?" she said. "And they see what I saw today?" "They'd be angry," he said. "Yes. Angry men without resources are still just angry men." "Yes," she said. "But angry men with 23 sets of records that all say the same thing." She let it hang. He looked at her for a long time. The light was nearly gone. Inside the house, she heard Toby say something and Jonah argue with it, and the ordinary evening sound of 6 boys existing in a space, which was different from the silence she'd walked into 24 hours ago. She didn't know exactly how or when it had changed, but it had. "You were going to leave this morning," Nathan said. "I was." "Why didn't you?" She thought about lying. She thought about a clean, simple answer. She said, "Because of Sam's hand, and then because of the papers, and then because of Isaac and the flower." She paused. "And because somebody hung those peppers over your stove, and you haven't been able to take them down, and I know what that is, and I thought someone should." Nathan turned and looked at the house, at that specific window. He didn't say anything for a long time. "I can't pay you," he said finally. "I can't offer you anything that was in any letter anybody wrote." "I know. The boys are going to get attached." His voice had gone rough. "They're already attached. Sam asked about you twice while you were gone." "I know. And if this doesn't work, Nathan," she waited until he looked at her, "it might not work. I want to be honest with you about that. I've been honest with you about everything else." She straightened up from the fence. "But this is what I know how to do, and you don't have a better option, and I think you know that." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up the hammer and his tools and turned toward the house, and she fell in beside him, and they walked in without touching. 2 people who were still in the very early and fragile stages of deciding whether to trust each other, on a ranch that might not exist in 6 weeks, under a sky that was going dark in every direction. She took the peppers down that night, after the boys were in bed. Nathan was in the front room with the papers again. She lifted them off the hook carefully, the dried red skins brittle between her fingers, and she wrapped them in a cloth and set them in the corner by the back door, not thrown away, just moved. She didn't know why exactly. Some things need to be moved before they can be let go. She was wrapping them when she heard Nathan's voice from the doorway. "That's the last thing she put up," he said. 2 weeks before the end of October." Evelyn kept her hands still on the cloth. "I know. I couldn't." He stopped. "Every time I thought I would, I couldn't." "I'm not throwing them away," she said. "I just moved them." He stood there in the doorway and she heard him breathe. It wasn't steady. "She would have liked you," he said, and she could hear what it cost him to say it, and she did not turn around because a man that private needed to say a thing like that to the back of a room. "I'd have liked to know her," Evelyn said. He went back to the papers, and she sat down at the table, and she pulled out her notes from the county records, and they worked in the same room in the same silence for an hour, 2 people separately doing the same thing, which was trying to figure out how to hold something together that was already coming apart. The next morning, Caleb Brody saddled his horse before breakfast and said he was going to the Henderson place, 5 miles east. Evelyn didn't ask him to. She didn't even suggest it. She had said her piece to his father, and Caleb had been awake, and Caleb was 16 and had been carrying this family in the places his father couldn't reach, and he had his own arithmetic, and it had led him to the same answer. He came back at noon with Bill Henderson, who was 62 and had the look of a man who'd been angry for so long he'd stopped calling it anger and started calling it the weather. Henderson got down from his horse, looked at Evelyn, looked at Nathan, and said, "You got papers?" "I've got papers," Evelyn said. "Show me." She showed him. He read slowly, and while he read, the kitchen was very quiet, and Sam came in and read the room and sat down without being told to. Finally, Henderson put the papers on the table and pressed his hand flat on them. "I got records go back 8 years, he said, "and they don't match what I paid." He looked at Nathan. "Who else are you going to?" "That depends," Nathan said slowly, "on whether you're in." Henderson looked at the papers one more time. He had the expression of a man who had been told he was alone with something for a long time and is only now starting to believe that might not be true. "I'm in," he said. By Thursday, there were 7 ranchers at Nathan's kitchen table. By the following Tuesday, there were 14. They came in the evenings, most of them, and they brought their papers, and Evelyn spread everything on the table and showed them what she'd found. And every time she did, she watched the same thing happen. That shift, from shame to recognition, from I was a fool to I was a target, and those were not the same thing, and the difference mattered more than she could say. Nathan watched it happen too. She caught him watching, sometimes, from across the room, not at the papers or the men, but at the moment the shift happened in them, at the change in a man's face. On the Friday of that second week, when the last of the 14 had gone and the boys were in bed, and it was just the two of them in the kitchen again, Nathan poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. It was such a small thing. She'd made the coffee herself. He was just moving it across the table. "There's a federal circuit court," he said. 2 days' ride. I've been thinking about who I know. There's a man. He rode with my father. He's a lawyer in Cheyenne." Evelyn wrapped both hands around the cup. "He probably won't take this case," Nathan said, "but he'll know someone who might." She nodded. "I'll ride out Monday," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a request, and something in his voice had changed, very slightly, from how it had sounded 11 days ago in the road. Not softer. More like a door that was still heavy, but had started to move on its hinges again. "I'll have your notes ready," she said. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside the window, the valley was dark, and the first crickets were going, and somewhere in this house, 6 boys were sleeping more soundly than they had in a long time, and the papers were stacked on the table between 2 people who had not known each other 2 weeks ago and now knew each other in the way you only know people you've been in the same small trouble with. The 14 had become a beginning, and Langford, whoever had told him about the records visit and the evening meetings and the growing pile of documentation, had not yet moved. That wouldn't last. She knew it. Nathan knew it. And on Monday, he would ride for Cheyenne, and she would be here with the boys and the house and the papers. And when Langford's man came, because the man would come, she had no doubt about that. None. She would need to be ready. She already was. Nathan left before dawn on Monday. He didn't make a production of it. He had his saddlebag packed the night before. His notes from Evelyn's copies folded into the inside pocket of his coat. And when she came down at 4:30 to start the stove, she found him already in the kitchen drinking coffee he'd made himself, which was bad enough that she quietly poured it out and made a fresh pot without comment. He watched her do it. He didn't object. "Caleb knows what needs doing at the north fence," he said. "Isaac's got the watering schedule. The boys will listen to him mostly, except Toby." "Toby listens," Evelyn said. "He just pretends he doesn't, so you'll say his name again." Nathan looked at his cup. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I know." She handed him the fresh coffee, and he drank it standing up, the way a man drinks something when he's already somewhere else in his head. She had his notes in an envelope on the table. She'd made 2 copies, one for him and one she was keeping. And she pushed it toward him without making it a moment. "The Henderson records are in there too," she said, "and the Morrison property. Those are your 2 clearest cases besides your own. Any lawyer worth anything will see it in 10 minutes. And if the man in Cheyenne can't help, then you ask him who can. You don't come back without a name, Nathan. Any name. A direction." She met his eyes. "Don't come back with nothing." It was a harder thing to say than it sounded. He heard it that way too. He picked up the envelope and put it in his coat. 5 days, he said. Maybe 6. "We'll be here." He looked at her for a second. Just a second. The way a man looks at something he's not ready to examine directly. And then he went out, and she heard the horse, and then she heard nothing. She stood in the kitchen alone in the dark, and the house breathed around her, 6 boys asleep upstairs, and she thought about what she'd said. "We'll be here." She hadn't planned it. It had just come out like it was already true. She let it be true. There was no particular reason not to. The days without Nathan had a different texture. Harder in some ways, quieter in others. Caleb stepped up the way she'd known he would. He had a natural authority that came from years of filling a space nobody else was filling, and the younger boys responded to it without thinking about it, which she suspected was both necessary and not entirely fair to a 16-year-old. She watched him carry it and thought about how to give some of it back without making him feel she was taking something away. She found her opening on the second evening when Caleb stayed up after the others to go over the fence repair schedule by lamplight. He was writing it out in a careful hand, columns and numbers, and she sat across from him and said, "You're good at that." He looked up, surprised. "It's just lists. Lists that keep 6 people in a working ranch organized. That's not just lists." He went back to his writing, but something had shifted slightly in how he was sitting. "Can I ask you something?" he said, without looking up. "Go ahead." "What happens if Pa comes back and there's no lawyer? Or if there is one, but the judge is—" He stopped. "We've got 5 weeks left, and I know Pa thinks you can fix this, but—" He put the pen down. I just need to know if there's a real chance or if we're just... He didn't finish. You're 15, she said. 16. 16. And you've been the adult in this house for 2 years. She said it plainly, without pity. So I'm going to answer you like an adult. There is a real chance. These records are real. What Langford did is real, and it's documented, and it happened to enough people that it can't be called a misunderstanding. She paused. But real chances aren't sure things. Your father knows that. I know that. I think you know it too. Caleb was quiet. What I can tell you, she said, is that before I got here you had no chance at all, and now you have one. That's not nothing. He picked the pen back up. No, he said. It's not nothing. She let him work. She went back to her own papers at the other end of the table, and they sat like that for an hour, 2 people doing the work in front of them, which was all either of them could do. Langford's man came on the 3rd day. It wasn't the same man from the records office. This one was older, heavier, with a suit that was too good for the dust on it, and a way of getting down from his horse that suggested he was used to people watching him do it. He had a second man with him who stayed on his horse and didn't speak. Evelyn was in the yard when they came up the road. Isaac was with her, and Caleb came out of the barn when he heard the horses, and then Wesley appeared in the doorway of the house, which meant he'd been watching from the window. The man in the suit introduced himself as Gerald Marsh. He had a card. He gave it to the air between her and Caleb like he wasn't sure which one was in charge, and Caleb took it before she could. Mr. Langford, Marsh said, has asked me to convey some concerns about some recent activity in the county records office. Activity is legal, Evelyn said. Of course it is. He smiled. It was the same friendly, flat voice as the man in the office, and she understood it was trained that way. Mr. Langford's concern is simply that any misunderstanding about tax records could be resolved much more efficiently through a direct conversation. He's a reasonable man. He's helped several families in this valley with their financial difficulties, and he'd like the opportunity to... Mr. Marsh, she said it quietly. I've seen the records. He kept the smile. Records can be confusing. I've seen 14 sets of records from 14 properties, and I have notes on 23. She watched his face and saw the smile become a thing that was only technically a smile. I know what the discrepancies add up to. I know what they look like on paper, and I know how they'll read to a federal circuit judge. The man on the horse shifted his weight. Marsh put the smile away. Mrs. Brody, Mercer. Miss Mercer, there are faster ways for this to go. Mr. Langford is prepared to offer... Tell Mr. Langford, she said, that what he's prepared to offer is not something I'm prepared to hear. A beat. Marsh looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him with his father's exact expression, the door closing plank by plank, and said nothing. I'd encourage you, Marsh said, and his voice had gone quieter now, not friendly flat anymore, just flat, to think carefully about the position you're in. Mr. Brody's situation is not resolved. The order of September 1st hasn't changed, and Mr. Langford has been very patient. Noted, Evelyn said. They left. The man on the horse looked back once. She held her ground until they were past the bend, and then she turned and found all 4 boys who'd been visible had been joined by Toby and Jonah, who had apparently materialized from somewhere, and Sam, whose hand was healing well enough that he'd stopped holding it against his chest. 7 faces looking at her. It's all right, she said. Go finish what you were doing. Nobody moved. Toby, what were you doing before they came? Watching you, Toby said. Before that. Watching Isaac. Isaac, what were you doing? Watching the road, Isaac said, completely without irony. She went inside and sat down and took 3 slow breaths. Her hands were not shaking. She was grateful for that. But her stomach was a different matter. She knew what Marsh hadn't said directly. That the offer was the last soft version of a harder conversation. That if she kept pushing, the next thing Langford sent wouldn't come with a card and a suit. She also knew she had no choice but to keep pushing, which meant the next thing was coming regardless. She wrote to the men, all 14 of them. She kept the note short. Langford has been approached. There may be pressure coming. Hold your records and hold your ground. Don't talk to anyone who comes from town unless you know them. She sent Isaac with the first 6 letters and Caleb with the other 8, splitting the valley between them. Then she sat down and wrote a longer letter to an address she'd gotten from the records office, a federal land office 3 territories over that she had reason to believe had been fielding complaints about exactly this kind of thing for 2 or 3 years. She wrote it very carefully. She cited the records. She named numbers. She named properties. She did not name Langford in the first paragraph because she'd learned long ago in the hospital that you got further with a regulator if you let them find the predator themselves, rather than handing them a name they'd feel they had to argue with. She named him in the second paragraph. Nathan came back on the 6th day. She heard the horse and was outside before he'd reached the yard, which she noted about herself and chose not to examine. He looked tired in a different way than usual, not the grinding tiredness of the ranch. This was the tiredness of 2 days hard riding and difficult conversations, the kind that sat in the shoulders. He got down and handed her the saddlebag, and then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "His name is Arthur Gaines," Nathan said. "He practiced in Cheyenne for 20 years. He's going to be in Millhaven in 3 weeks for another case, and he'll look at what we have." She took the paper. "Does he think—" He didn't make promises. Nathan took the saddlebag back and slung it over his shoulder. "But he read the summary I brought and he didn't laugh. He said—" Nathan paused, looking for the words. "He said it had the shape of something he'd seen before, which I guess is the best you can say without seeing the whole picture." She exhaled. She hadn't known she was holding it until she let it go. "Langford's man came while you were gone," she said. Nathan's face tightened. "And?" "I told him no. They left." "They'll come back." "Yes," she said. "But I sent letters to the Federal Land Office, and I wrote to Gaines's office last night." She handed him the copy she'd kept. "I want you to read it before it goes." He read it standing in the yard with the horse behind him. She watched him read, the way his eyes went still when he got to the part with the numbers, the way his jaw set. "This is everything," he said. "Almost. I've got more that I want Gaines to see in person." She paused. "Is that all right? I didn't— These are your records. Your land. I should have asked before I wrote to the land office." He looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen there before, and it took her a moment to recognize it because it had been so absent from everything he'd shown her. It was relief, not hope, not yet, but relief. The particular relief of a man who has been the only one inside something terrible for a very long time and has just, for the first time, been able to put part of it down. "You don't have to ask me," he said. "I do. It's your family." "Evelyn." He said her name in the same way as that second time, with the weight of a fact rather than an address. "It's your family too." At this point, whether or not— He stopped, cleared his throat. "Whether or not anything else, you're part of this house." She looked at the ground for a second. Just 1 second. "All right," she said. "Then the letter goes tomorrow." The 3 weeks before Millhaven were the hardest and the strangest in equal measure. Langford moved the way a man moves when he's stopped being patient, but hasn't yet decided to be reckless. Small things first. The mercantile in Red Hollow started being slow on orders placed by families who'd been at Nathan's table. A man named Greer found 2 of his fence posts cut through in the night. Not broken, cut, the kind of thing that takes time and intent. An unsigned letter went to Morrison saying his deed had irregularities, and he ought to come into the county office to discuss it before things got complicated. Morrison rode to Nathan's instead. He came in the evening, and Evelyn was there, and she read the letter and said, "Don't go." Morrison looked at her and then at Nathan. "She sure about that?" "She's been right about most things," Nathan said, which was maybe the most he'd ever said about her in front of someone else, and she pretended not to notice. "If there are irregularities in my deed, there are irregularities in his records," she said. "Not yours. If you go in there alone, whatever meeting they have planned, you walk out of it owing something you didn't owe when you walked in." She set the letter on the table. "Don't go alone. Don't go without a lawyer. Don't go at all until after Millhaven." Morrison chewed on that. He was a man who'd been making his own decisions for 40 years and had opinions about it. "All right," he said finally. Millhaven. The fence came down on the Brody property 3 days before Millhaven. Not the north fence that Caleb had been working on. The east fence, the one along the road, which was visible from a quarter mile and which someone had gone along systematically and pulled. 40 yards of it, post pulled and wire cut. Evelyn found out because Jonah came running to the house at 7 in the morning yelling that the fence was gone and the Henderson cattle had come through the gap in the night and were in the east field. She sent Jonah and Toby to Henderson's. She sent Isaac and Wesley to round up what cattle they could. She and Caleb and Sam's hand was well enough now for light work, and he wasn't going to be told otherwise, started resetting posts. It was August hot, and the ground was dry, and the work was slow and ugly, and Sam kept dropping things and picking them up and not saying anything about it because he decided he was helping, and he was committed to this. And Caleb at one point said, "Sam, you don't have to," and Sam said, "I know," and kept going. And Caleb looked at Evelyn over Sam's head with an expression that was 3/4 exasperation and 1/4 something that looked a lot like pride. They were on the third post when she heard the riders. 4 of them. Coming from the road. Not Marsh this time. 3 of the 4 she didn't recognize. The 4th was a man she'd seen once in Red Hollow, standing near Langford, the kind of man who exists near powerful men to make them feel powerful. He got out front and stopped and looked at the 3 of them standing in a half-repaired fence line. "Morning," he said. Evelyn put her post driver down slowly. Caleb didn't put his down. "Mr. Brody's not here," she said. "I can see that." The man looked at the fence. "Shame about that. These old posts, they don't hold like they used to." He had the particular ease of a man who knows you know why he's there and enjoys the knowing. "Mr. Langford wanted me to remind you that the land office in this county processes all transfers through his office. The September order is still on calendar." "I'm aware of the date," Evelyn said. "And you've got—" He made a show of counting on his fingers. 17 days. 16, said Caleb, and his voice came out hard and flat and surprised everyone, including him. The man looked at Caleb for the first time. Really looked at him. "Son, you've got a good face. Don't make it ugly by getting involved in things that—" "This is his land," Evelyn said. She took one step forward, not aggressive, just closing the distance to a place where it was clear she was not going to be walked over. "This is his father's land and his family's land, and he is involved in it whether you like that or not." She kept her voice very level. "You've delivered your message. You can go." One of the 3 men behind him moved his horse sideways a step. Just a step. Enough to mean something without being something you could point to. Sam, behind Evelyn, made a small sound. She said without turning around, "Sam, go to the house." "I'm not—" "Now, Sam, please." She heard him go. She counted the seconds while he was crossing open ground between her and the house, and she kept her eyes forward, and Caleb kept his post driver in his hand, and the 4 riders sat their horses, and nobody moved. Sam got to the house, the door closed. The man in front smiled. 17 days, he said. "One more time. Think about what matters to you, Miss Mercer." They left. Caleb waited until the sound of the horses was gone, and then he drove the post in the ground so hard she heard the shockwave go up through the driver. "Caleb!" "I'm fine." "I know. The post is taking the worst of it?" He looked at her, startled. Then something broke loose in his face that was almost a laugh and didn't quite get there. "Yeah," he said. "The post." She picked up her driver. 3 more. They didn't talk much for the rest of the morning. There wasn't much to say. The fence was either going to hold or it wasn't. The meeting with Gaines was either going to be enough or it wasn't. And the thing she hadn't said to anyone, the thing she hadn't written in any letter, the thing she sat with at night when the house was quiet, was that Langford wasn't wrong about the September date. Legal challenges took time. Even a strong case, clearly documented, moved through courts at a pace that had nothing to do with urgency, and no judge anywhere had ever moved faster because a family needed him to. She knew this. She had known it from the first night with the papers. What she also knew was that Langford had been doing this for 10 years because everyone he'd done it to had been alone. And the moment you weren't alone anymore, the calculation changed. Not necessarily fast enough, but it changed. Nathan came back from a supply run that afternoon, and she told him about the riders. She told him about the fence. She told him about what the man had said to Caleb, and she watched Nathan's hands close the way they did when he was containing something large. "I should have been here," he said. "You were getting supplies we needed." Still. "Nathan, Caleb handled it, and it wasn't—" She considered her words. "They came to scare us." That's what that was. And we didn't scare. He looked at her for a moment. "Did you scare?" "Enormously," she said. "On the inside." He was quiet. "Me too," he said. "Most of the time. On the inside." She hadn't expected that. She thought she'd stopped being surprised by him, but apparently not. Arthur Gaines was not what she'd expected. She'd built up a picture over 3 weeks. Formal, large, the kind of lawyer who used his voice like a tool. What arrived in Millhaven's single hotel room, which smelled like old wallpaper and something Nathan refused to identify, was a compact man in his late 50s with wire glasses and a habit of picking up papers and setting them down in new positions that seemed meaningful only to him. She and Nathan had ridden 2 days to get there. She'd brought everything: originals, copies, the notes from the county ledger, the comparison tables she'd built across 14 properties, and the letter from the federal land office that had arrived 5 days after she'd sent hers, which said in very careful language that her inquiry was being reviewed and that an agent would be dispatched for a preliminary interview. Gaines read for 40 minutes without speaking. Nathan sat beside her on a bench that was too short for him and said nothing. She sat with her hands folded and said nothing. Outside the window, Millhaven went about its afternoon. Finally, Gaines took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "How many properties did you say?" 23 confirmed, she said, possibly as many as 30, but I only have direct documentation on 23. And you gathered this from the public ledger, in one visit. He put his glasses back on. He picked up one of the comparison tables she'd made. This is very clear work. I had time, she said. Are any of the other property owners willing to participate in a formal complaint? 14 who've already agreed. I believe I can get more. He set the table down. Miss Mercer, what you have here is not a strong suggestion of fraud. It's a documented pattern of it. The question is whether we can move fast enough to— September 1st, Nathan said. Yes. Gaines looked at him directly. I won't pretend to you that a court action will be resolved by September 1st. It won't. Nathan said nothing. Evelyn felt him not say it. What I can do, Gaines said, is file for an emergency injunction against the transfer order on the grounds that the underlying debt is in dispute and supported by evidence of systemic fraud. That's a different mechanism. That's not a full trial. That's a judge saying stop until this gets sorted. He paused. The judge in the circuit is a man named Clarence Holt. I've appeared before him twice. He is not comfortable with Langford. I happen to know they have a history. And he is very uncomfortable with forged public records. If I can get this in front of him with what you've brought me, I think the injunction is possible. The room was quiet. Evelyn said, How soon can you file? I can draft the petition tonight. It needs 2 more things. He looked at the papers. First, a sworn affidavit from you on the records. Second, he picked up the letter from the land office. This contact. I want to speak to whoever sent this before I file. If there's an active federal inquiry already in motion, that changes the weight of the petition considerably. I can get you the contact, she said. Tonight. Gaines looked at her over his glasses. You came prepared. I've been prepared for 3 weeks, she said. I didn't know who I was preparing for. He almost smiled. Most lawyers don't walk in with material this organized. I'm not a lawyer. No, he said. What are you? She thought about it. A woman who came off a stagecoach 11 days ago with $11 and 1 carpet bag. A woman who'd spent 3.5 years learning to look at things that were wrong and figure out what would make them right. A woman who'd stood in a road and been publicly humiliated and chosen to stay anyway, for reasons that had started with a small boy's hand and become something much harder to explain. I'm part of this family, she said, and it came out quietly and firmly and without apology, and Nathan Brody, sitting beside her on the too short bench, did not say a word, because there was nothing to argue with. That night, while Gaines drafted the petition and Nathan wrote his own affidavit and the hotel made its old wallpaper sounds around them, Evelyn sat at the small table and wrote the final details for the land office contact and thought about Red Hollow, about 14 ranchers holding their papers, about Caleb driving a fence post so hard the ground shook, about Sam saying, is my hand going to come off in a wagon bed, and the honesty it had taken to answer him straight. She thought about Langford, sitting in that good coat on the boardwalk on the day she arrived, amused, watching what he thought was a foregone conclusion play out. She thought about what it looked like now, from where she was sitting. She had 11 days left. The petition had to work. The injunction had to hold. And even if it did, there was a longer fight ahead that would take months and that none of them could fully see yet. But there was a petition. There was a lawyer. There was a federal inquiry, and 14 families and a stack of documentation that had started as her own notes in a bad county records room. And there was Nathan Brody's name at the bottom of an affidavit that said clearly and in detail what had been done to his family and his neighbors. He wasn't a man who asked for help. She'd understood that in the first hour. He carried things alone until they broke him, and even then he found a way to carry the pieces. She wasn't sure that had changed entirely. She wasn't sure it would. But he'd ridden 2 days to a lawyer's room. He'd put his name on the paper. And when Gaines had asked him, at one point, whether he was willing to go on record about everything, the payments, the intimidation, the riders at the fence line, Nathan had looked at Evelyn once, just once, and then looked back at Gaines and said, all of it. That was something. That was not nothing. Outside, September was coming like a deadline, and inside the room, 3 people worked by lamplight on the pieces of a fight they had not yet won and could not afford to lose. They rode back from Millhaven in weather that couldn't decide what it wanted to do. The sky went gray on the first afternoon and stayed that way, pressing down. And by the second morning, there was wind with something mean in it that wasn't quite rain but wasn't not rain either. They rode mostly without talking, which was comfortable in a way that still surprised Evelyn. That she could be 9 miles into open country with a man she'd known less than a month and feel no pressure to fill the air between them. Nathan spoke somewhere around midday on the second day. You didn't have to come to Millhaven. She glanced at him. Gaines needed the affidavit. I could have brought the documents. You could have. She considered. But I'd built the comparison tables. It's faster when the person who built something explains it. He was quiet a moment. That's not why. She looked ahead at the road. No, she said. It's not. He didn't push further, which she appreciated. The truth was simpler and more complicated than logistics. She'd gone because she hadn't been able to imagine not going. Because somewhere in the weeks since she'd arrived, she'd stopped being a woman who was staying out of necessity and started being a woman who was staying because this fight was hers as much as anyone's. And she couldn't fully say when that had happened or whether she should be worried about it. She decided not to be worried about it. She had enough to be worried about. They reached the ranch by late afternoon on the 8th day since Nathan had left for Cheyenne, which meant they had 11 days until September 1st, and the injunction petition was in Gaines's hands, and the only thing left to do was wait and keep the fences up and not let Langford see anything that looked like weakness. Caleb came out of this barn when he heard them, and his whole face changed at the sight of both of them returning together, which told Evelyn something about what the past 8 days had cost him. How'd it go? He asked. He was asking Nathan, but looking at her. We'll know in a few days, Nathan said, getting down. How are things here? Greer's fence got cut again, and Morrison came by. Caleb took the reins. He's worried. He got another letter. Same as before? Different. This one named a date, week from Tuesday. Nathan looked at Evelyn. She looked back. That's before the 1st, she said. Yes, Nathan said. She went inside. Sam was at the table with Wesley, some kind of card game laid out between them that stopped being a card game the second she walked in and became 2 boys looking at her with enormous innocence. That's not homework, she said. It has numbers in it, Wesley said. She took her coat off. Sam. Hand. He held it out. She checked the skin. The redness was completely gone, color good. The scar tissue closing clean. She pressed gently at 2 points, and he didn't flinch. Good, she said. You can start using it normally. Don't overdo it. What's overdo it? If it hurts, you've overdone it. Sam thought about this with the serious face he used for all medical information. Okay. Where are Toby and Jonah? Toby's in the loft, Wesley said. He said he wasn't, but he is. Jonah? Behind the loft. He paused. He also said he wasn't. She went upstairs and did not find Toby and Jonah in the loft or behind it, but she did find them under a blanket in the corner of Caleb's room, which meant the card game downstairs was probably connected to the hiding upstairs. In some way she didn't have the energy to trace. She lifted the blanket and looked at them. Dinner in an hour, she said. 2 pairs of eyes blinked at her. You're not in trouble, she added, because the looks on their faces required it. But you will be if that blanket goes back over your heads. They came down in 4 minutes. She made dinner, and Nathan set the table, which he'd started doing without being asked sometime in the second week, and which she had not commented on because she'd learned that Nathan Brody did things better when nobody was watching him do them. They ate, and it was loud in the way the table had gotten louder over the past weeks. Not chaotic, not the edgeless noise of boys unsupervised, but loud with actual conversation, with Toby's opinions on things that did not require opinions, with Isaac correcting Jonah on something factual and Jonah disputing the correction on principle. It was, she thought, looking around at it, the sound of a family that was starting to believe it was going to be all right. She was careful not to believe it too hard herself. There were 11 days. The letter from Gaines came on the 4th day. Nathan brought it in from the road and set it on the table without opening it, which was how she knew he was afraid of what was in it. She picked it up and opened it herself because waiting had never helped anything. She read it. She read it again. Then she set it down. The injunction was granted, she said. Nathan went very still. Preliminary, she said. Gaines says preliminary, which means it's not permanent. But the September 1st transfer order is suspended pending full review. Holt signed it yesterday morning. Nathan sat down. He sat down the way a man sits when his legs have made a decision his head is still catching up to. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. She gave him a minute. There's more, she said. Gaines says the land office agent has been dispatched. He's coming here, to the valley. He wants to see the original records and meet with the property owners in person. She paused. That's bigger than the injunction, Nathan. That's federal eyes on Langford's books. He looked up. His face was doing something complicated that she had come to recognize as him working through emotions in the order he was willing to admit to them. You wrote that letter, he said. You let me write it. Evelyn? We did this, she said. Not sharply, just firmly. All of us. You, me, Caleb, 14 families who showed up with their papers. This is not one person. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I need to tell the others. Yes, she said. I'll come with you. They rode to 6 properties that afternoon, she and Nathan splitting the valley between them and meeting back at the Henderson place to tell the old man himself. Henderson read the letter, looked up, looked at Nathan, looked at Evelyn, and then went to his kitchen and came back with a bottle that had been opened possibly once in the past decade. I don't drink much, he said, pouring 3 glasses with the solemnity of a man doing something significant. But I think this is the occasion. Evelyn did not especially want whiskey. She drank it anyway. It seemed like the right thing. It was. Henderson's hands were shaking slightly when he put his glass down, and she understood then that this man had been carrying his particular version of this weight for 8 years, alone, in the way Nathan had been alone, and that the shaking was not weakness, but release, the specific physical fact of putting something very heavy down. My wife always said he'd get caught, Henderson said. She said a man like that can't keep books on enough people without the books turning on him. She died 3 years ago. Nobody said anything. She was right, he added. I'd like to have told her. Evelyn put her glass down. She knew it when she said it. That's something. Henderson looked at her for a moment. You're a good woman, he said, with the directness of someone his age who had decided compliments should be delivered plainly or not at all. Nathan's a lucky man. Nathan said, Bill, I'm just saying what I see. Henderson stood up with some difficulty and extended his hand to Evelyn. Thank you, young lady, for not minding your own business. She shook his hand. I never have been very good at that. The problem with relief is that it creates a gap, and gaps get filled with whatever's been waiting. Over the next 3 days, as word spread through the valley about the injunction, Evelyn watched it happen to Nathan. The immediate pressure had eased enough that the other things, the things he'd been keeping behind the wall of sheer survival, started finding cracks. She noticed it first at dinner on the 5th day after Millhaven. He was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, which was the quiet of a private man comfortable with silence. This was the quiet of someone listening to something inside himself. She waited. That night, after the boys were in bed, she found him in the front room with the lamp low, not reading, not working, just sitting. She came in and sat across from him without asking if it was all right, because she'd learned he needed people to make that decision for him sometimes. You're thinking about Rachel, she said. He didn't seem surprised she'd said it. How'd you know? Because you get a different look, not sad exactly, more like... She tried to find it. Like you're standing in a room where someone used to be and you can still feel where they stood. His hands were in his lap. She would have known something was wrong with the taxes 6 months before I did. She had that kind of mind. He paused. She would have liked you. I said that before. You did. I meant it differently than it sounded. How did it sound? Like a courtesy. He looked up. That's not what I meant. I meant she would have seen what you're worth in about 10 minutes, and I... He stopped. It took me longer. She let that sit. Nathan, she said, you were a man with a drowning ranch and 6 boys and a fraudulent tax debt, and someone showed up you hadn't asked for. I don't hold it against you that you needed time. I said it in front of the whole town, he said. The words had more weight than a statement of fact. They had weight like a confession. Yes, you did. That's not something you just know, she said. It isn't. But I've also seen you drive fence posts in August heat for 2 hours before breakfast and put a blanket on a woman sleeping in a chair even after she'd told you she was fine, and sit with your son's papers by a dark lamp because you were trying to figure out how to save something that mattered to him. She held his eyes. People are more than their worst moments, Nathan. I learned that in a hospital, and I learned it again in the past month. He looked at her for a long time. I don't know what I'm offering you, he said. Still, even now, the land might hold, the case might. There's still so much that isn't settled. I know. You deserve something settled. Maybe, she said. Or maybe I'm exactly where I want to be. She stood up. Let's settle what we can and see about the rest. She went to bed and he sat in the dark a while longer, which she had come to understand was how he processed things, and she did not take it personally. The land office agent arrived on a Tuesday. His name was Deering, young, precise, the kind of man who wrote things down before other people had finished saying them. He came with a federal letter of authority and a leather case full of paper, and he set up at the county records office with a demeanor that made the county clerk visibly uncomfortable, which Evelyn considered an excellent sign. She had everything ready for him. She'd spent the previous 2 days reorganizing the full comparison, all 23 properties, the discrepancy amounts by year, the running totals, cross-referenced against the public ledger. She brought it to the records office herself, and Deering looked at the first page for 30 seconds and said, You made this? Yes. How long did this take you? Parts of it, she said, were made under some time pressure. He almost smiled. He was the kind of man who didn't quite let smiles finish. He went back to the pages, and she left him to it, because she'd learned that some people do their best work without company. She was crossing the street when Victor Langford stepped out of the building opposite. She hadn't seen him since the day she arrived. In 5 weeks, he'd been a presence made entirely of his representatives, Marsh, the writers, the letters, the cut fences. And she'd almost stopped picturing him as a person and started thinking of him as a system. Seeing the man himself was momentarily startling, the way it's startling to see the source of a noise after you've been listening to it for weeks. He looked older than she remembered. Not frail, not weakened, but there was something in how he was standing that had changed from the easy amusement of the boardwalk. He looked like a man who had done the arithmetic and didn't fully like the results. He said, Miss Mercer, Mr. Langford. They were 10 feet apart on a public street on a Tuesday morning, and she was aware that this was almost certainly the conversation she had no power to control, and that the outcome of it depended entirely on whether she kept her footing. That's a federal agent in my county records office, he said. Yes. You're doing a letter to the land office, she said, which anyone can write. He looked at her the way men look at things they underestimated and aren't ready to say so. You know, he said, when I saw you in the road that morning, bag in hand, nobody to go back to. He paused. I thought, here's a woman who's run out of options. I had $11, she said. That's not out of options. That's just limited. I thought you'd be gone by Thursday. He said it without malice, which was almost more unsettling than if there had been malice in it. I genuinely thought that. I know. What made you stay? She considered. A child with an infected hand, and the fact that someone needed to do some arithmetic. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he did something she didn't expect. He nodded. Not agreement, not surrender, just acknowledgement, the way a man nods when a card has been played well, even if the game is going against him. The injunction won't hold permanently, he said. That's not up to either of us. No, he said. I suppose it isn't. He went back inside. She stood on the street and let her heart settle. She'd been expecting something different from him. More force, more direct threat. What she'd seen instead was something that looked almost like a man taking stock, and she was not sure if that was better or worse. She rode back to the ranch and told Nathan. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything. He didn't threaten you, Nathan said. No, he was... She searched for it. Careful. Like a man who stopped being sure what his next move is. That could mean he's backing down. Or it could mean he's thinking about something bigger. She set her hat on the table. I don't know which. I don't trust the not knowing. What do you want to do? Wait, she said, and I want Gaines here. Or close. When Deering finishes his review, whatever he finds goes somewhere. I want Gaines to be the first call that information makes. Nathan was already moving toward the desk. I'll write him tonight. She went to check on Sam's hand. It was fully healed now, and she had quietly moved from medical oversight to simple habit, and found all 4 younger boys in the kitchen apparently involved in some organized effort that stopped immediately when she entered. She looked at the table, at the flower on Toby's sleeve, at the bowl that Isaac was covering with his arm. What is this? She said. Nothing, said Toby. What are you making? We're not making anything, Jonah said, with the specific intonation of a child who has rehearsed a lie and is deploying it seriously. She looked at Isaac. Isaac, who was 12 and had been the adult in this house for 2 years, met her eyes with a defeated expression and moved his arm. It was a cake. Or it was trying to be a cake. It was at the stage of being a bowl of gray-brown matter that had ambitions in the direction of cake. For Pa, Sam said, because of the injunction thing. She looked at the 4 of them. He doesn't know what an injunction is, Toby clarified, but we know it's good. She pulled up a chair. Move over, she said. You've got too much flour and no eggs. We couldn't find the eggs, Isaac said. That's because they're in the basket by the door where they always are. Oh. Move, I'll show you. That cake was, objectively, not a successful cake. The middle never fully set, and it leaned slightly to one side, and when Toby tried to get it out of the pan, one edge came with the pan and had to be pressed back. But they put it on the table after dinner, and Sam, who had been appointed spokesperson by some internal committee of boys, stood up very seriously and said, This is for you, Pa, because you didn't give up. Nathan looked at the cake, at Sam, at the other 5 faces arranged around the table in various states of anxious pride. He said, Thank you, Sam. Evelyn helped with the eggs, Sam added, because he was constitutionally unable to omit information. I know, Nathan said, and looked at her across the table and said nothing else. She cut the cake. It was better than it looked, which was a low bar it cleared just adequately, and Toby had 2 pieces and declared it the best cake ever made. And Jonah told him that was not an evidence-based conclusion, and the evening went on. It was 4 days later that Caleb came to her. He found her in the yard in the early morning, before anyone else was up, which she suspected was deliberate. He had that look, the look she'd learned to recognize, the one that meant he'd been carrying something long enough that he'd decided to put it down. She waited. I wrote the letters, he said. She looked at him. The marriage letters. The ones to you. He was looking at the fence line, not at her, in the way of someone saying something they've rehearsed because the unrehearsed version is too hard. Pa didn't write them. I did. I found the advertisement in a paper somebody left at the mercantile, and I wrote back and I kept the return letters in my saddlebag. And when Pa saw a letter addressed to him, I said it was a bill. The morning was very quiet around them. I used his name, Caleb said. I wrote as him. His voice caught for just a second, and he steadied it. I didn't know what else to do. Sam's hand was getting bad, and Isaac was trying to handle everything, and Pa he was here, but he wasn't really here anymore. And I just thought if someone could come, Caleb, she said. He finally looked at her. He was 16, and he had done a deceitful thing out of love, and he had been carrying the weight of it since the day she stepped off the coach, and his father said I never wrote a letter, and she could see what that weight had cost him. You should tell your father, she said. I know. The words came out like they'd been lodged somewhere painful. I know I should, but if he's angry, he's going to be angry, she said honestly. Probably, for a little while. She held his eyes. But Nathan Brody is not a man who misses the thing underneath the surface of a thing. He's going to be angry about what you did, and he's going to see why you did it, and those two things are going to happen in that order. What if he stays angry? I don't think he will. She paused. I can't promise it, but I know your father better than I did a month ago, and I don't think he will. Caleb looked at the fence, at his hands. You're not angry, he said. At me. For the letters. She thought about it. She thought about 11 days on a coach, and $11, and a man saying, "You're not what I paid for," in front of 40 people. All of it set in motion by a 16-year-old boy who was trying to hold his family together by any means he could find. No, she said. I'm not. He looked at her. You could have gone home. I didn't have a home to go to, she said. And I think you probably knew that, from the letters. His throat moved. I thought you sounded like someone who needed somewhere as much as we needed someone. She was quiet for a moment. You weren't wrong, she said. He told Nathan that evening. She was not in the room when it happened. She made sure of that, taking the younger boys out to the barn on a pretext that only Jonah saw through and that she managed anyway. She could hear the voices from the house, not words, just the rise and fall of it. Nathan's voice first, sharp and fast, and then going quiet, and then Caleb's, and then a long silence, and then Nathan again, lower, and then nothing. When she brought the boys back in, Caleb was at the table doing something with a harness, and Nathan was at the stove, which was not a place Nathan usually stood. His back was to the room. He said, without turning around, "There's water hot if anyone wants it." Toby immediately wanted it. The normalcy of Toby wanting hot water for reasons he explained at length broke whatever tension had been sitting in the room, and Jonah asked a question that led Isaac into a long answer that led Wesley to contradict something, and the kitchen became itself again. Later, much later, when everyone was in bed, Nathan came to the front room where Evelyn was finishing some notes for Deering's follow-up. He sat down across from her and looked at the table. He wrote those letters when he was 50, Nathan said. Yes. He kept it for a year. Yes. Nathan was quiet. She could see him working through the arithmetic of it. A 15-year-old boy, reading The Ranch, reading his father, reading Six Brothers, deciding that the thing they needed was a person, and that the only way to get one was to do a thing he knew he shouldn't do. I was angry, Nathan said. I know. For about, he rubbed his jaw, about 10 minutes. And then I couldn't, he stopped. He watched me go under for a year. He watched his brothers go under. And he found the only door he could see, and he opened it. She said nothing. She'd learned when to say nothing. He asked me if I was glad you came, Nathan said, after I stopped being angry. She looked up. I told him yes, Nathan said. I told him I didn't know how to say how glad I was, but yes. He looked at her, and there was nothing complicated in his face for once, nothing held back or guarded or in the process of being contained. He did a dishonest thing, and it was the best thing anyone's done for this family in 2 years. I don't entirely know what to do with that. I think, she said carefully, you just did it. You told him. He looked at his hands. I'm not good at You're better than you think. She set her pen down. You're better than you've given yourself credit for since Rachel died. I think you've been so busy trying not to fall apart that you haven't noticed how much you've held together. He was quiet for a long time. The lamp burned low between them. I'd like you to stay, he said. Not because of the case, not because of the boys or the ranch. He paused. I'd like you to stay because... He stopped. Started again. I'm better at this when you're here, at being a person, at being a father, at... He ran out of words which she thought was honest, and she appreciated honest. I'd like to stay, she said. He looked up. I'm not easy, she said. I have opinions about everything, and I'll tell you all of them. And I have $11 and a carpet bag and a scar and no family left, and I can't promise any of this works out the way we need it to. I know, he said, but I'd like to stay. He nodded once, and that was the whole of it, because they were both people who knew the difference between a thing being decided and a thing being finished, and this was decided and nowhere near finished. Deering's preliminary report went to the federal land office 14 days after he arrived. Gaines, who had come to the valley himself by then, read it with the careful face he used for everything and said, in his precise and unexcitable way, that it was the most comprehensive single-source documentation of systematic tax fraud he had seen in 20 years of practice. He said it the way a man reports weather. He said it sitting at Nathan Brody's kitchen table, with Sam next to him asking questions about what words meant, and Isaac on the other side listening in the way he listened to everything, storing it in some deep and useful place. Nathan sat at the head of the table, not because anyone had said to, not because she'd suggested it, or Caleb had positioned it that way. He'd simply sat down there for the first time since she'd arrived, in the chair that had sat empty for 2 years, and nobody said anything about it, and dinner went on. Evelyn sat across from Gaines and watched Nathan at the head of the table and thought about the road into Red Hollow on the day she arrived, about the man who'd turned his back on her in front of 40 people, about the weight he'd been carrying and the walls he'd built to carry it, and about how those walls had come down not with any single thing, but with a series of small things, a meal, a hand, a lamp in the dark, 14 ranchers with papers, a boy who'd written letters he shouldn't have. The case would go on. Gaines said months, and she believed him. There would be hearings and filings and responses from Langford's lawyers, who were better resourced than Gaines, and would use that resource without hesitation. There would be hard days ahead, days when it would feel far from settled, days when September 1st would seem almost peaceful compared to what a long federal process could do to a family's patience and nerves. She knew all of this. She'd learned enough in enough hospitals to know that getting through the immediate crisis was never the same as getting well. Getting well was slower and quieter and had worse days mixed in with the better ones, and sometimes you couldn't tell until later which kind of day you were in. But tonight there was dinner, and Gaines eating it without complaining, and Toby explaining to him at length what an injunction was based on his own research, which had some impressive gaps, and Isaac correcting Toby, and Jonah agreeing with Toby on principle, and Wesley eating in silence but with the particular quality of silence that meant he was content rather than absent, and Sam, healed hand and all, leaning toward Gaines and saying, "Did you know Evelyn fixed my hand before any of this?" Gaines looked at her. "I didn't know that." "It was infected bad," Sam said, with the proprietary authority of a child discussing his own medical history. She said it would hurt a lot, and it did, but she was honest about it, so that was okay. Gaines looked at Evelyn. There was something in his face that was as close to warm as she suspected he got. "That seems to be her approach generally," he said. Nathan looked down the table at her, and she looked back, and between them was everything that had happened in 6 weeks and everything that was still coming, and neither of them looked away. Gaines stayed 4 days, which was 3 more than he'd planned, and left with 2 saddlebags full of documents and the address of a federal contact in Cheyenne that Deering had given him before riding out the previous week. He shook Nathan's hand at the gate and then turned to Evelyn and said, in his precise and unsentimental way, "You built a better case than most lawyers I know. I want you to understand that." She said, "I had good material to work with." "No," he said, "you had raw material. You built the case." He put his hat on. "I'll be in touch within the month." He rode out, and Nathan stood at the gate watching him go and said, "A month." "At least," Evelyn said. "And until then, we do what we've been doing." She turned back toward the house. "We keep the fences up." It was not a satisfying answer. She knew that. Nathan knew it. The law moved at the pace of the law, and nobody could change that by wanting it to be different, and wanting it badly didn't count for anything in a federal proceeding. What they had was the injunction, still holding, Langford's lawyers having filed a response that Gaines said was aggressive but not unexpected, and the knowledge that Deering's report was in federal hands, and 14 families who had decided not to be alone anymore. That had to be enough for now. Some days it was. Some days it wasn't. October came and the valley changed color, and the work of the ranch shifted into the particular hard season of preparing for winter. The fences reinforced against weather rather than men. The stores laid in. The animals moved. Nathan worked differently than he had 2 months ago. Not less hard, but differently. With a quality of purpose that had been absent before. The difference between a man working to delay something and a man working towards something. She noticed it without mentioning it. Some things you named and some things you let be. The boys changed too, in ways that were harder to name but clearer to see. Isaac had started reading in the evenings, which he hadn't done before, as if some part of his attention had been freed up for something other than vigilance. Wesley, who had said so little in the first weeks that she'd sometimes forgotten to account for him, had begun to develop opinions, which he expressed with the cautious precision of someone who had been saving them up and was now rationing them out. Jonah remained Jonah, loud, certain, wrong about approximately half of everything, and entirely committed to the wrong half. Toby had attached himself to Evelyn in the specific way of a young child who has decided on a person and will not be moved, following her from room to room with a running commentary on his life that required very little response beyond occasional acknowledgement. And Sam showed her his hand one morning, turned it over in the light, looked at the scar that was now pink and fading. "Is it always going to look like that?" he asked. "Probably," she said. "It'll fade more, but there'll be a mark." He looked at it. "Like yours." She touched her jaw without thinking. "Yes, like mine." "Does it bother you?" he asked. "Still?" She thought about the honest answer. "Sometimes," she said, "less than it used to. The thing about a scar, Sam, is you stop seeing it every time you look in a mirror, and you start only seeing it when someone else makes you remember it's there." He thought about this carefully. "So it only hurts when other people are mean." "Something like that." "That's their problem," he said, with the clean moral certainty of a 6-year-old, and went back to his breakfast. She sat with that for a while after he went out. The hearing was set for the 3rd week of November. Gaines wrote with the date and with a set of instructions for what Nathan needed to bring, and with a note at the bottom that said the Federal Land Office had expanded the inquiry to include properties in 2 adjacent territories, which meant what Langford had been doing in this valley was apparently not limited to this valley. Nathan read the letter at the kitchen table and then read it again. 2 other territories, he said. "He was careful," Evelyn said. "He spread it wide enough that no one place felt the full weight of it. Until now." Until now. Nathan folded the letter. "How many people do you think?" "I don't know," she said. "More than 23. Possibly a great deal more." He was quiet. She had come to understand that Nathan's silences had different textures, and this one was the texture of a man absorbing something that was simultaneously worse than he'd thought, and somehow also clarifying. Like learning that the wound was deeper than you'd realized, but at least now you knew where to clean. "We should tell the others," he said. "Yes." He looked at her across the table. "Do you want to come?" She'd been waiting, quietly, to be asked rather than assumed. She didn't make a thing of it. "Yes," she said. They rode out that afternoon, both of them, the way they'd ridden to Henderson's the day the injunction came through. The valley was cold now, the light lower and thinner, the trees stripped back. They went to 8 properties. At each one she watched Nathan tell it. The expanded inquiry, the 2 territories, the November hearing, and she watched something happen to the men listening that she hadn't quite seen before. Not just relief, which she'd seen in August. Something steadier. The look of men who were starting to believe that this wasn't going to collapse back on them. Henderson cried. He turned away and looked at the wall of his kitchen, and his shoulders moved once. And when he turned back, his face was arranged back into its normal 70-year configuration, and he said, "Well, all right then," and poured coffee without asking if anyone wanted it. Nathan took his coffee and didn't say anything about the moment, which was the right thing, and Evelyn looked at the window and gave Henderson the privacy of being unremarked. On the ride back, in the late afternoon cold with the horses moving easy, Nathan said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "Not about the case," he said. She waited some more. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "and I want to do it right this time, which means not doing it in a road in front of 40 people either way." He kept his eyes forward for a moment, then looked at her. "I don't have a ring. I've got a ranch that's still technically in legal dispute, 6 boys who are going to be your problem whether you want them or not, and a first impression that I would very much like to eventually stop being the most memorable thing about me." She rode for a moment without answering. "That is the worst proposal I've ever heard," she said. "I know, I practiced it, and it was worse before." He looked at her directly. "I'm asking anyway." "Nathan," she said, "I told you 6 weeks ago I'd like to stay." "That's not an answer to what I'm asking." "Yes," she said. It is. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, all right, in a voice that was doing its best to sound like that was a normal thing and not managing it. And she looked ahead at the road and allowed herself one small private moment of being entirely happy, which she had not felt in so long she'd almost stopped expecting to. The wedding was small. She hadn't wanted a production and Nathan hadn't suggested one, and the boys, when told, had reactions that ranged from Toby announcing it to the chickens immediately to Wesley saying good with a completeness that suggested the topic was settled, to Caleb standing in the yard with his hands in his pockets, looking at the ground for a long moment before he said, quietly, I'm glad, and meant it in all the layers it could be meant in. Sam asked if he could stand next to her. She said yes. It was done on a Wednesday in October with the judge from Mill Haven, who had ridden out as a favor to Gaines, and with the 14 families from the valley who had become something more than neighbors in the past 2 months. Henderson stood at the back with his hat in his hands and said nothing during the ceremony and everything with his face. The Morrison boys had brought something in a covered dish that turned out to be a pie of ambiguous construction but sincere intent. Evelyn stood in her good dress, the gray one with the collar she'd restitched, which she'd washed and pressed until it was as good as it was going to be. And she held Nathan's hands, and she thought about the road into Red Hollow, about the carpet bag and the $11, and the moment he'd looked at her the way a man appraises something lame. She thought about how she'd wanted to say something cruel back, about the gap between the woman who'd stepped off that coach and the woman standing here, and whether those were really different women or just the same woman in different circumstances. She thought they were the same woman. She'd just found better circumstances. Nathan said his words. She said hers. Sam, true to his post beside her, whispered, "That's the right answer," when she said yes, which broke something in the ceremony that required everyone to collect themselves. She didn't cry. She'd never been a crier in the easy situations. She saved it for the ones that hit sideways. The one that hit her sideways was Henderson, afterward, taking her hand in both of his and saying, "Rachel would have called it exactly right," and then walking away before she could answer. She looked at Nathan, and Nathan looked at her, and she nodded once, which was the whole conversation. November came cold and fast, and the hearing came with it. They went to the county seat with Gaines, who had spent 3 weeks preparing and who was, in the way of truly prepared people, visibly calm, in the way that isn't really calm but is disciplined so thorough it looks like calm. He had the documentation, all of it, every property, 2 territories worth, the comparison tables Evelyn had built, and the follow-on tables Deering's office had added, which took her original work and ran it across records she hadn't had access to, and found the same patterns scaled up by a factor that made her stomach turn the first time she saw it. Langford was there. He had 2 lawyers, both from a firm in the capital, both in expensive suits that announced their expense without being obvious about it. He sat behind them at the respondents' table, and he looked, for the first time, like a man who understood what he was sitting in. He looked at Evelyn once when she came in. She met his eyes. She did not look away. Judge Clarence Holt was 60, white-haired, with the manner of a man who had heard a great many things in his courtroom and had stopped being impressed by most of them. He read the submitted documentation before the hearing began. She could see the file on his bench, dense with paper, her comparison tables visible from where she sat, and he read with the particular stillness of someone to whom a document is speaking very clearly. Gaines presented for 2 hours. He was not dramatic. He did not need to be. He walked through the documentation the way you walk through a well-organized house, here and here and here, and then here. And what emerged was not a complicated story. It was a simple story. A man had found a mechanism and used it, systematically, over 10 years, across 3 territories, to take land from people who were too alone and too afraid, and too stripped by grief or weather or circumstance, to fight back. That was the whole of it. Everything else was just the numbers that proved it. Langford's lawyers fought. They were good and they were thorough, and they found every genuinely ambiguous point in the record and stood on it. They argued administrative error. They argued misinterpretation. They argued that the collection practices in question were within the legal authority of the county assessment structure, a line of argument that required some impressive maneuvering around the fact that the county assessment structure was itself under federal scrutiny. Holt listened to all of it. He asked questions of both sides, sharp and specific, the questions of a man who had read the file and was testing what he'd understood. At one point, he looked directly at the table where Evelyn sat with Nathan and said, "The original comparative analysis. Who prepared this?" Gaines said, "My client, Your Honor, Mrs. Brody." Holt looked at her. "You're not an attorney." "No, Your Honor." "What's your background?" "Hospital records and nursing, Your Honor, for about 6 years." He looked at the file. "This is meticulous work." "Thank you." "I'm not complimenting you," he said, not unkindly. "I'm observing that it's the clearest documentation of a recurring pattern I've seen in a case of this type, and I want the record to note who produced it." She said nothing. Nathan's hand found hers under the table and held it, not dramatically, just present, just there. Holt recessed for 1 hour. She sat in the corridor with Nathan and Gaines and didn't talk much. Nathan got water for all 3 of them from a pump in the yard and handed it out and sat down, and Gaines reviewed his notes one more time, and she looked at the wall and thought about Henderson and Morrison and 23 families and however many more in 2 other territories, and about a man in a good coat on a boardwalk who had thought she'd be on the Thursday coach. Holt came back and ruled. He ruled against the transfer of the Brody property and suspended all related seizure orders pending the full federal investigation. He referred the matter of the county records office to the territorial attorney general for independent review. He ordered the return of all documented overpayments, principal plus interest, calculated from the date of each transaction, to each affected property owner on record. He formally recognized the Federal Land Office inquiry as the governing authority on the matter and removed it from county jurisdiction entirely. Then he looked at Langford's table. He said, "The evidence in this case documents a deliberate, sustained pattern of fraud against property owners across 3 territories over a minimum of 10 years. The sophistication and duration of this pattern indicate it was not opportunistic but systematic. This court refers the matter of criminal liability to the federal prosecutor's office, with the recommendation that it be treated as a priority matter." He closed the file. Court is adjourned. Langford's lawyers were already talking to him in low voices before the gavel was down. He didn't look at Evelyn. He looked at the table in front of him, and she thought about what she'd said to Nathan weeks ago, that Langford had come after all of them because they were alone, that the entire mechanism of what he'd done depended on people never finding out they weren't the only one. What it looked like now was what happened when you took that mechanism away. She did not feel triumph. She'd learned enough in the hospital to know that the end of a bad thing and the beginning of a good thing were not the same moment. This was the end of one phase and the beginning of a long process of repair. And repair was slow and uneven and had bad days in it. And not every family in those territories would get everything back, because some things you can't recover on paper. But the land would hold. That was real. And the records would be corrected. And whatever federal process came next for Langford, it would come with 23 families' worth of documentation and 2 territories' worth of evidence and a federal judge's formal referral. And that was more than he'd been facing 6 weeks ago when he'd stood on a public street and told her that the September date hadn't changed. She thought about saying something like that, some version of justice served, some tidy conclusion. She was too tired for it, and it would have been untrue. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a direction you tried to move in, and sometimes the moving was enough to be grateful for. Nathan said, on the courthouse steps, "It's done." "The first part," she said. "Yes." He looked at the street. "The first part." Gaines shook hands with both of them and went back inside to file the immediate paperwork. She and Nathan stood in the November cold, and she thought about what came next. The return payments to 14 families, which would take months to process. The criminal referral, which would take longer. The 2 other territories, which were only beginning. The ranch, which still needed a full season's work to come back to what it could be. 6 boys at various stages of being repaired by time and stability, and the simple fact of enough food and enough warmth and someone paying attention. None of it was finished. All of it had started. They rode home in the dark, arriving late enough that the boys were in bed and the house was quiet, and Caleb had left a lamp burning in the window. She saw it from the road and felt something that had no clean word in her. A recognition, maybe. The specific weight of a place where someone's left a light for you. She'd spent 4 years after the fire in rooms that nobody left lights for. Caleb was asleep on the couch in his coat, which meant he'd been waiting and lost the argument with his own exhaustion. Nathan looked at him for a moment, and then got a blanket from the chest by the wall and put it over him, and Caleb didn't wake. Nathan looked at her. She nodded toward the stairs. They went up, and the house settled around them. And outside, the November wind moved through the valley, and the fences held. The months that followed were not easy, and she would not have said they were. The process of recovery at the scale they were dealing with had no clean arc. It advanced in some places and stalled in others, and the pace of federal proceedings bore no relationship to the pace of actual human need. Two families in the Second Territory lost properties before the injunction could reach them, and that was a real loss for real people. And no amount of eventual restitution changed what those families had been through in the meantime. That stayed with her. She didn't let it be packaged into something that could sit quietly. But through the winter and into the spring, the valley changed. The Henderson Ranch was the first to replant its east fields, Henderson announcing this to Nathan over the fence one March morning as if it were a mild piece of weather. The Morrison boys, who had been stretched to the point of breaking for 2 years, hired on a hand for the first time. A young man from up north who needed work, and turned out to be useful with horses in a way that justified himself in about a week. Money came back slowly. The overpayment returns processed through Gaines's office across 4 months, small amounts and large ones. And it was not enough to undo 2 years of grinding, but it was something real, something that could be built on. The Brody Ranch came back the way most things come back, stubbornly and unevenly and without any particular drama. The Eastfield went in first in April, Nathan and Caleb and Isaac working it in sections over 3 weeks. The north fences, which had needed replacing for 2 years, got replaced. The house got a new window in the back bedroom that had been cracked since the previous winter. Isaac glazing it himself from a book he'd found somewhere and following the instructions with an exactness that produced a window that was level and well-sealed and slightly uneven in one corner in a way that nobody mentioned. She planted a kitchen garden in May. Nothing ambitious, herbs, some greens, early radishes. Toby helped and managed to water 3 things that were already watered and missed 2 things that needed it, and she let it go, because Toby's participation in anything was worth the occasional casualty. Langford's criminal matter moved through the federal system with the grinding slowness of things that involve multiple jurisdictions and lawyers with resources. She followed it through Gaines, who sent updates with his characteristic lack of drama. By June, there were formal charges. By August, there was a trial date. She did not follow it the way she'd followed the civil matter, with constant attention and anxiety, because she'd learned something in the past year about the difference between the things you can change and the things you can only watch. She could not change what the federal prosecutor did with the case. She could plant her garden and fix the window and make sure Sam did his reading and that Caleb didn't work himself past useful into damage, which was a thing he had a tendency toward. The verdict came in September. Exactly 1 year, she realized when the letter arrived, from the September 1st date that had loomed over everything. Gaines's letter was 2 paragraphs, which for Gaines was practically a speech. Langford had been found guilty on 14 counts of fraud, 4 counts of falsifying public records, and 3 counts of extortion. He would not be managing tax records or property transactions for what remained of his life, and what remained of his operation in the valley had been placed in receivership pending the settlement of civil claims. She read it twice and then put it on the table. Nathan was in the yard. She went to the door and said his name, and he came in, and she gave him the letter and watched him read it. He put it down. He didn't say anything immediately. "Is it enough?" she asked. Not rhetorically. She actually wanted to know what he thought. He considered. "No," he said. "Not for the families who lost properties before the injunction. Not for the years." He looked at the letter. "But it's what there is." "Yes," she said. "It's what there is." He picked up the letter and folded it carefully, the way he handled things he intended to keep, and he put it in the desk drawer that had once held the hopeless papers in the dark. That evening at dinner, she looked around the table that had been silent for 2 years and was now loud in every direction at once, which was sometimes wonderful and sometimes a great deal, and tonight was both at the same time. Caleb at one end, 17 now, and carrying himself differently than he had a year ago. Still responsible, still the oldest, but no longer drowning in it. Isaac beside him, who had decided he wanted to study law and had written 3 letters to schools and was managing the disappointment of waiting with the patient seriousness of someone who has decided what he wants and is willing to do what it takes. Wesley, who had opinions now and stated them, mostly about animals and weather and the right way to do various tasks, which were frequently correct. Jonah, loud and certain and wrong about things with extraordinary consistency and equal consistency in recovering from being wrong. Toby, who had once watched her arrive as a stranger and said, "So you're brave," and meant it entirely. And Sam, healed hand and all, who was 7 now, and who treated everything she said on any subject as factual and final, which was a weight she tried to carry carefully. Nathan, at the head of the table, where he'd started sitting and hadn't stopped. She thought about the woman who'd gotten off the coach with $11 and no home to go back to, and what she would have made of this table. She thought she probably wouldn't have believed it. She thought she probably would have been right not to. Not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't the kind of thing you could believe at a distance. You had to be in it. You had to stay long enough for it to become true, and staying had been the thing that was always, at every point, the choice. She could have left Thursday. She could have taken the coach and gone somewhere and found some other version of her life, smaller and quieter, and without the particular cost of standing in a road being publicly rejected and choosing to stay anyway. Maybe that life would have been fine. Maybe it would have been enough. But she had looked at a small boy's hand, and she had looked at a stack of papers in a dark kitchen, and she had looked at dried peppers hanging over a cold stove, and she had made a different choice over and over, in moments that didn't announce themselves as important but were. That was what she would have told anyone who asked. Not that it had been easy, or that she'd known how it would go, or that she'd been brave in any useful sense of the word. Just that she had stayed when staying was hard, and done the next thing in front of her, and then the thing after that, and that those small choices stacked up over weeks and months had built something that she could sit inside now and feel the weight of. After dinner, after the table was cleared and the boys had drifted through their various evening orbits, she sat on the porch in the September cooling, and Nathan came out and sat beside her without a word. The valley was going gold and amber at the edges, the light low and lengthening. From where they sat, she could see the Henderson place, a smear of lamplight in the distance. She could see the repaired fence lines, the replanted east field, the barn that needed painting, but would get it eventually. She thought about what Henderson had said at the wedding. Rachel would have called it exactly right. She thought she understood it better now than she had then. Not that she was a replacement or a continuation or any version of the woman who had hung those peppers. Just that a house that had stopped being a home had become one again, in the particular way that requires people rather than things, requires presence, requires someone willing to cook the meal and look at the papers and treat the hand and sit at the table and stay. She was not perfect at any of it. She burned things, still. She had opinions she deployed at the wrong moments, and she was too direct sometimes, as Nathan had said once, not critically, but as a fact about her. She had nights when her jaw ached where it hadn't ached in years, and she couldn't fully explain why. She was learning to be a mother to 6 boys at once, which was an education that would not finish quickly and probably never finish entirely, and she made mistakes in it regularly enough to stay humble. But she was here. And it was September, and the land was still the family's, and across the valley 14 families were heading into winter with their properties intact and their papers corrected and the particular knowledge that they were not alone. Toby opened the porch door and said, "Sam put something in the stove and I don't know what it was." Evelyn stood up. "It was an experiment," Sam's voice called from inside. "Sam," she said. "It's contained," he said, with the confidence of someone who has thought carefully about this word. She went inside. Nathan followed her. Behind them, the September valley went on doing what valleys do, holding the light as long as it could and then letting it go, easy and without complaint, the way you let go of anything once you've accepted that the dark will end and the morning comes back around regardless. Inside the house, there was a small amount of smoke, and Sam explaining himself, and Toby providing commentary, and the sound of 5 other boys becoming interested in the situation in various ways. Evelyn looked at the stove, and at Sam, and at whatever the experiment had been, and she felt something she had no word for. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, but the full feeling of a life that is actually yours. The good and the difficult and the ridiculous and the costly, all of it woven together into something that could hold a person's weight. She dealt with the stove. She stayed.